Welcome back to CannaWeek, brought to you by New Frontier Data, where we deliver the week's top headlines in cannabis and hear experts in the industry weigh in on the impact these stories are having on the industry. I'm your host, Heather Wickline. We are excited for our first guest to welcome him back. He has 10 years experience in the legal cannabis industry and is considered a national expert in the diverse licensing regimes governing each state. He's the founder and managing partner at Merida Capital Partners. Please welcome back Mitch Baruchowitz. Thanks for coming back. Absolutely. And our next guest is, now I feel like my partner in crime on here. He's a pioneering thought leader in the cannabis industry and the fearless leader of our amazing research team here at New Frontier Data. Please welcome our Chief Knowledge Officer, Mr. John Kagia.
Delighted to be back, Heather. Thank you.
Well, we have lots to cover, and I know you guys have a lot of great insights for us, so we're going to dive right in. Last week, FreshToast.com reported a global pandemic has caused legal marijuana to cannibalize the black market. So the battle between illicit and legal markets is an ongoing issue. Obviously, it's tricky to have a solid number on illicit sales since dealers aren't exactly offering up their sales numbers, but it's estimated to be around 4 times the legal market. And now with this pandemic, things are changing. It would seem consumers are now prioritizing health and safety above of a cheaper product, I guess. Mitch, you're actually quoted in here stating that the recent growth is due to consumers transitioning away from the black market to the legal market. So I guess my first question, Mitch, is to you. Why do you believe the industry is having such a hard time competing with the black market, especially even in areas that offer like recreational adult use, like Colorado and California?
Right. The irony of discussing an article using that data is that not only did it quote us, but I was using New Frontier Data to write an article that was then quoted everywhere. So it's very cyclical. So I guess I'm quoting.
So all roads lead to us.
Give me information on my own quoted. So it's a little self-deprecating, but and John was phenomenal about, if you saw the email back and forth, because we think this is a fundamentally maybe the largest issue for people to focus on over the next year or two as you see the maturation of many of the MSOs. But you know, it's interesting to look at why the industry is having, I don't think it's actually having a hard time competing with the legacy illicit market. I think it's actually doing a great job, but I think you have to fundamentally focus on the consumer behavior aspects of it, right? We're in a place now where a lot of the cannabis companies they've built their infrastructure, they spent the CapEx, especially in the US, right? You have a pretty fast maturing industry, and then you run into consumer behavior then at that point. So the legacy, you think of legacy behavior and people walking around dealing with illicit dealers and illicit supply chain. And so the early, when you had a broad illegality in the cannabis market, when it could even be called a market in 2000, 1995, all the way forward, you then look at the behavior that people start to develop. So the early adopters in the legal market in cannabis were probably heavy users in the illicit market. And those people were willing to take all kinds of legal risks to consume the product. And I think it's really hard to fundamentally change that behavior of, I have a friend who grows, he has a good supply, it's being delivered to me. So when, you know, and John was fundamental in helping me develop this thesis of what are the differences between the legal market and the illicit market? And what we really came down to at the end is, I think the legal market's doing a phenomenal job of providing what we call the consumer quartet: quality, safety, access, and choice. The one area that the legal market is still struggling to really compete with is price. And I think John actually made this point to me, which is, and I don't want to speak for John because he can definitely speak well for himself, but price is something that we think will regress over time. So I want to I'm not pushing back on the thesis that the legal market still has a long way to go because the illicit market is just so much larger. But I do think that the legal market is competing and doing a great job in everywhere but price so far.
I actually saw on LinkedIn that you responded to someone that was saying how we shouldn't even be considering the illicit market a competitor necessarily.
Well, I hear all kinds of things every day, but you know, there's about 12,000 other people who read the commentary we put out that actually wrote, you know, that many of them commented about this is an eye-opening thing and how COVID put it into context. Again, using a lot of New Frontier data that I couldn't have made the points I was trying to make, but if you look at the consumer aspects, it's unequivocal that this is the first year where you're truly going to see on a gross or an absolute basis, the legal market really wipe the floor with the illicit market in terms of growth, right? Cannabis consumption is growing 3, 4, 5% total. And the legal market is grabbing the lion's share of that growth now. And John, I mean, I guess you have more data than I do, but I think that's going to be the more of the norm going forward.
Yeah, completely agree with that assessment, Mitch. And I think there's kind of two fundamental points that need to be framed as you understand how this market is evolving. One, legalization, the initial part of a legal market's growth is not about creating new consumers. And I think that's something that a lot of stakeholders who aren't observing the space just fail to understand. The idea isn't that legalization is going to persuade somebody who has never consumed cannabis to now walk into a dispensary and buy cannabis for the first time. The overwhelming proportion of demand is going to be from consumers who are well versed with cannabis, have been consuming it likely for a long time, have been very comfortable accepting the risks associated with participating in the illicit market, and now are weighing the options available to them in the legal market and trying to make that assessment. And to Mitch's point about, you know, the quartet of issues that the legal market leads on, which are safety, choice, access,
Quality and access, yeah.
And quality, is that while all of those are really important in persuading consumers to transition from their illegal sources to the legal market, price remains that critical hinging factor. And they're willing to pay a premium for those four elements, but they're not willing to pay, you know, 100% more just for the benefit of those, because they've had really good success with a very efficient, unregulated market. They're happy with the products that they have, even though they may not realize just how much better the products are in the legal market. And so once you start getting that price, it doesn't need to be parity. It doesn't need to be a one-to-one price comparison between the legal and or illicit market. It just needs to be close enough that the consumer sees the value of getting that higher quality product, doing it in a safe location, being able to purchase it in a way that's really convenient, that they're willing to pay that incremental 10, 15, 20% more. And once you get that legal market price point to within 20% of the unregulated market, then you're able to really ignite that transition from the unregulated to the legal market. And I think that's what we're seeing now in most legal markets. Taxation plays a critical role in this, but even in places where taxes are quite high, like California, ultimately the market gains such economies of scale that even with high taxes, just the scale at which cannabis is being produced brings those prices down. And that's when you see that accelerated transition, particularly as consumers start to see the benefits of being in the legal market with the quality, with the product selection.
And you know, John, there's the one other fundamental point that absolutely drives home that is, in certain markets, you're going to see the use skew to older consumers. Those are people that primarily, I mean, most people aren't discovering cannabis for the first time at 70 years old. They're legacy users who have walked into a dispensary and are wildly blown away by the choice, the packaging, the labeling, the certainty of product. I mean, but the choice, like I said, that we call it the consumer quartet. Obviously, that's a Merida created construct, but it really is that construct. When someone in the legacy market goes, and you know, as we've spoken about, you know, at length, I think the important thing is COVID actually helped disrupt enough of the supply chain that people, legacy users, actually felt compelled to go into legal, and once, you know, into legal locations. And once they saw what is available for them on the legal market, that, you know, there used to be this like pinky in the air elitist thing, like, oh, you're going to a legal dispensary. I've got this guy who grows 12 plants a year. It's wonderful. It's, you know, it's so crap. And then that person walks into a dispensary and they're like, whoo, I just saw 46 different kinds of variety. Like, you could do THC by, you know, if you do it by numbers, it's like the Dewey Decimal System. I mean, you can literally get anything you want in legal dispensaries for the most part.
Absolutely. Yeah. That initial dispensary experience, particularly for the long time unregulated market consumer who is a connoisseur in the unregulated market, but they're a connoisseur on a very, very narrow band of types of products. So they don't know anything about edibles. They don't know anything about the vape market. They may have some orientation to flower and to concentrates, but even that tends to be in a fairly rudimentary way. That first experience, particularly when they walk into a well-developed, well-executed dispensary experience, it becomes very, very difficult for the illicit market to compete with that on a sustained basis. And that's the power of choice.
You know what we call that, actually? We have, and then we can move on to another subject. I have an image to put in your mind for those of you who know game shows in the US. For Merida, we call that the supermarket sweep moment. Mm-hmm. If you know that game show, right?
Yeah.
That's the illicit market guy just sweeping everything with all his arms off the shelf as fast as he can. So.
Yeah. No, it's funny that you were saying that you don't know any 70-year-old. I actually have two 70-year-old relatives that have never smoked weed, consumed it at all, but had like knee replacement or some kind of surgery, and they were so afraid of opioids, you know, they didn't want to take them to go to sleep. And so, you know, my husband and I both were like, why don't you try this? And
look, obviously there are going to be new consumers of every stripe, old, young, medical.
Yep.
But for the reality is, when you see legacy users are obviously going to be older than 21, because those people grew up in legal market. Like essentially, if you're 16 or 17 and you were, you know, I'm not in any way condoning anyone that isn't of age consume anything, right? You know, we should try to discourage youth use as much as possible. But people who grew up in the modern, you know, the last decade have pretty much never understood what pure illegality means, and what people in California or other markets really suffered through, and why choice was so constrained, and why there were medical cooperatives. They don't even understand the legacy, and really they're in a new world. It's a totally new paradigm to them. And so that's why, if you're finding, like John and I were talking about, the real hardcore legacy users, they're transitioning. They're going to be 40, 50, 60, because those are people who already accepted all of the risks of participation in a wildly illegal market compared to today.
Yeah. Well, I have a question for you then. What steps, if any, can lawmakers take to like kind of keep that trend going towards people moving towards the legal market away from black?
So there's two trends that we've actually been following. I mean, John already nailed the first one, so I'll keep it really short. Taxation has to be well thought out, and I think a lot of states are looking at it as revenue drivers, and so they have to be a little smarter, like John said, to try to create a parity so that whatever you pay in taxes as an operator that's passed on to consumer can be then made up in volume and scale. But I will add one other element that we're seeing as a trend, and I haven't really seen it widely covered, so I'm happy to introduce it on like a data-driven platform like New Frontier, is you're really seeing in the last 3 to 4 years, you know, I grew up in the early medical markets when the regulators were someone who, it might have been the guy who raised his hand at the wrong time in a Department of Health meeting or a pharmacy meeting or something. And so the regulators really weren't dedicated cannabis regulators. And what you're noticing over the last 2 to 3 years is really, whether it's Michigan with the MRA, whether it's the BCC, which, you know, was originally a totally another agency, or the MCC in Maryland, you know, a lot of these states have been smart about creating actually dedicated regulatory groups who manage these. So that means more understanding of the space, a better understanding of the consumer. You get a more dedicated effort, and because that, you get a more responsive effort, which was essential in COVID, right? The responsiveness of most of the states to COVID was fast, effective, accurate, and precise. You don't often get that with regulation, but for some reason, because these regulators are, you know, in Massachusetts, a perfect example, you have a great regulator who's really plugged into what's happening on the ground. And you get that in a lot of states. And I think early on in the first 5 or 6 years of cannabis' evolution from 2010 to 15, you had these regulatory groups that weren't as familiar. Actually, they were being educated in real time alongside the operators and the consumer. And now you're getting dedicated groups who can rely on New Frontier data and other sources to make better decisions. And they can go to an industry group and have discussions that really lead to real-time solutions. So I think actually we're closer than we've ever been to getting the kind of responsiveness on the regulatory side to get a real cohesive and cogent thought on taxes. But taxation, it all starts and stops with that for me. I know John referenced that before, but I still think the taxation in many places is, if not unfair, it doesn't understand, it shouldn't be taxed necessarily the way it's taxed, or it should be maybe like a value added tax rather than just a gross excise tax or some other element. So, I mean, that's our view, but I think that we're moving that direction as regulators get more educated. And I think that we're already well on that way because of this professionalized regulatory operators who are now much more responsive to the industries.
I would just add to that, and I agree with everything that you've said, Mitch. And I think that's a great kind of perspective on what the regulators should be doing, which is be focused on this, because this is a very dynamic, very complex environment, and critical that that your attention is focused, that you're kind of tailoring the responses specifically to this really unique market in our economy. But on the lawmaker side, you know, I think fundamentally one of the things that I think is still lacking, particularly at the federal level, is understanding who the American cannabis consumer is. You know, the fact that we still see such a great disconnect between the public's view toward legalization on a national basis and what Congress or the White House and federal governing authorities are willing to do. I think is partly deeply rooted in this idea of, at the national lawmaker level, there's almost a complete disconnect in understanding between the understanding of legalization and abstraction and understanding who the cannabis consumer actually is. And I think if, as on a national basis, we had a much more intimate view into the cannabis consumer, into the homes of the cannabis consumer, it makes it real in a way that I think will help dramatically accelerate the national conversation on why so much of our federal discussion around cannabis remains so punitive, why we've seen such a kind of acute disconnect between the progress made at the state level versus progress being made at the federal level. And third, once we appreciate who is consuming cannabis in America and understand acutely that the cannabis consumer in America represents America, it is about as diverse socioeconomically, ethnically, racially as you can get. This is across, the cannabis consumer is the American. Then I think there'll be much more urgency in this idea of, if this is truly the emergence of a global economy, what role can America play in leading this emergence? There's a lot of, for all that has happened at the state level, cannabis as a global economy is not going to happen until the US plays an important role, a catalytic role in both stimulating the conversation and helping the global market understand, the consumer and the market in which the consumer lives. And I think there's still a long way from that happening at the federal level, and that's largely because the federal lawmakers don't understand who the cannabis consumer is.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's, first of all, it's a completely spot on point. And I think when you think of people always ask, it's like the first question when you talk to someone who's casually knowledgeable about cannabis is, what's going to happen at the federal level? And we often as investors say, it doesn't really matter. A lot of our portfolio companies are clearly, we're investing with this view. Merida has a very specific view of what legalization, quote unquote, legalization looks like, whether it's a descheduling. And we think there's certain, industries like companies like New Frontier that benefit wildly from, when all of a sudden everything becomes a fire hose instead of a drip, right? And people have to consume and get their head around. But I do think that people do underestimate how important it is that states have extremely stable regimes going into that federalization in some way, whether it's a descheduling or otherwise. Early on we used to make a joke, this is 2013, so it's like ancient history, but we used to make a joke about how every state, it's like, they might borrow some elements, but they all have to have their own recipe for a cannabis. Like, why not just copy the 2 or 3 states that are working, right? Connecticut has a good regime, but their lab testing is tighter. Colorado does this righter. And what you realize is there's geographic differences. And I think those elements, regulators also want to feel like they've taken what works and then reduce risk even further, or taken steps that reduce, that risk further. And I think that does skew things, whether it's taxation. Regulators now almost look at it as a quid pro quo. If I'm going to legalize, then I want to resolve another issue that we're facing at the state level, revenue or whatever it is. And I think that's why COVID, when we first said COVID is like changing the cannabis industry, we weren't saying it flippantly, but everyone thought we kind of were. But we were actually saying that we think it's going to fundamentally change the mindset. It's going to make regulators much more open. They're going to look at it as this kind of bargaining piece. And we haven't seen no states legalized in the COVID world. But clearly by 2021, you're talking about Arizona rec on the ballot. The states that can do ballot measures are moving forward very quickly with it. And the states that can't, like a Virginia, Missouri, they're looking at rec very seriously, even though they're very early in their medical regime, largely because of what you just said.
Right. Well, let's move on because I don't want to run out of time. And I know that we want to get to this next one. Chicago Tribune last week reported recreational marijuana sales reached almost 61 million in July, setting a record for the 3rd month in a row. So it is awesome to see Illinois is crushing it. The decision to deem both medical and recreational dispensaries essential at the beginning of this lockdown was huge for supplying the state with much needed tax revenue, especially since they'd only been legalized since January. Mitch, what do you think are a few things that Illinois is really doing right to, account for this success?
Well, first of all, I think you nailed the essential. They're one of the few states that made recreational dispensaries essential. Most people only looked at it from a pharmacy perspective. It's a medicine. And so that's one thing. I mean, this is going to sound completely maybe too intellectualized, but, I'm with John here, so you can't ever get too intellectual with him. But, I think actually it's part of what they used to do wrong that created this pent up demand. They used to fingerprint patients. They had a completely fragmented, there's 4 regulatory agencies involved. And, you know, it's actually fortunate that there's some really good operators there. You have Cresco, GTI, Ascend, Forefront, some really good multi-state operators who can manage that labyrinth during the medical phase. But so what they did right is they allowed, I think it's structural. They allowed all the existing operators to kind of flip a switch and become recreational, which meant you had like your supply chain intact. You didn't have to start from scratch. You didn't have to go through like Michigan, which by the way, the thing that no one talking about, Michigan is literally the singing bird that no one's hearing. I mean, Michigan's bigger than Illinois right now from a total sales perspective, and no one's talking about it because there's very little MSO exposure there. You know, it's mostly a highly fragmented small state, which, you know, we have one of the largest retail footprints there. So it's a state that I know well, but you know, Illinois, they allowed flip the switch. They had all this pent up demand because their medical industry wasn't really hitting the mark. They had one of the lowest patient visits from a percentage of people who hold medical cards for a year or two, where, you know, from 2015, you can ask Cresco, GTI, or other guys what they thought. I mean, it was absolutely atrocious. The amount of patients that were visiting per month was like 30% or 40%. Now they were buying a huge amount because they're probably buying for other people in a quasi illicit market way. But that's what you get when the rules are so draconian. But now what they've been really responsive on flipping the switch. I think their taxation is quite attractive, so that you're not running into people sticking. I mean, back to pricing, right, John? If it's anywhere close to parity, you're going to get huge legal market growth. It's just that simple. Because the other 20 years ago, the guy growing using 3 lights in his garage was growing really good product. Nowadays, there's no way that you can say unequivocally that illicit market product is beating the legal market in quality. It's just not happening. The amount of money and automation and other things that legal market operators are doing is so phenomenal that you're getting safe, incredibly powerful medicine that people can tailor, and just the choice. So I truly think Illinois, the flip the switch thing is huge, because a lot of other states, Michigan made you step back, and there was a whole transition, which, you know, I think we've managed, but a lot of people have, but it took a lot of chunk out of the market. Illinois, it's just been vertical because taxation's not bad, and really that flip the switch. When you do a flip the switch where existing medical operators can just go through a small process to validate, you're going to get huge sales and huge growth, and then it builds on itself. And then John made this point before, legality is a huge driver of behavior, because new consumers that stigma disappears very quickly. So I think Illinois is one of the few states where you're seeing not just huge growth of illicit market transitioners, you're seeing new consumers come to the market in a big way.
John, what are your thoughts on that?
Just echoing everything that Mitch has said. You know, the operators who survived the medical market in Illinois, because they crawled through the muck. I mean, it was a nightmarish market for a good stretch. But that trusted the grit. And for those who were able to come out of that process, it did a couple of things. It meant that if you're able to operate in a really, really lean, hyper-efficient model, then when times are good, your margins become that much better. Your approach to serving the consumer becomes that much more effective, because you've had to do it while the times have been most difficult. So I think having that training or that proving ground, it was terrible for those who had to live through it, and not everyone made it out on the other side. But for those who kind of had their mettle tested during the messily regulated medical market, I think we're very well positioned now to capitalize on the legal market when it became available. But I also think, you know, Illinois is also benefiting from the timing with which they went rec. So, you know, the convergence of an efficient transition to legalization, as well as the just void demand that we're seeing from the COVID period, where by and large, we're seeing between 25 and 40% increases in sales month over month since over the second quarter, has meant you already had a market that was going to be doing very, very well, even in a non-COVID environment. But then you've had that demand additionally goosed by people who are home, have time to consume, are excited to consume these new products that are legally available, are being able to secure those products from operators who have who know their stuff. These MSOs who have, you know, real kind of dirt under their nails, and so the ability to have time on your hands and efficiently and fastly kind of growing access to the legal market, and a well kind of presented, well branded, well marketed portfolio of legal products, I think has created this perfect storm in Illinois that will serve that market really, really well for the next 12 to 18 months.
Upstream swimmers tend to be stronger swimmers than the people that are going downstream their whole life. It's true. I mean, if you see it in most of the MSOs are built on it. I mean, we wrote about this, I think 2 years ago, that anyone who thinks the MSOs aren't going to really succeed doesn't understand what they had to go through to get to 2018, right? I mean, if you want a license in 2013, 14, 15 in any medical state, you swam upstream, and by the time they turn rec, it's just, you're just stepping on the gas at that point. So I agree. You know, John nailed it, basically.
So Mitch, what do you think are some other opportunities that exist in Illinois for investors right now?
Well, I mean,
or is it just, are they too late?
You have to read one of my earlier writings, Lemon versus Lemonade. I think professionalized investing, I think it's very hard for the average person to find sourcing and, you know, do the diligence. So I've always said that if you're you know, you can articulate a thesis on the public market, but I really think it's hard to articulate a private thesis the way like a professional investor can. But in individual states is hard to invest in unless, you know, you have access to those operators. You know, someone might apply for a license and maybe you can invest in that individual, let's call that mom and pop, even if it's professionalized. Mom and pop is, in our view, is like a one or two or like a sort of one-off operator, which there's great operators in Pennsylvania, Illinois, Maryland that are one-off operators. But I think investment in those, the real, you know, our view on investing is much broader macro thesis now at this point, looking for companies that are going to benefit from the large explosion of addressable markets, certain ancillary companies. We think medical data, consumer data is where it's all at. You know, we think that those elements built around a state-based licensing, you know, smart tactical investing is the way to go. So if you're an individual investor and you're looking for some exposure to Illinois, obviously you can look at all the public companies that have deep exposure there. You're not going to find those companies having deep exposure to Michigan because very few MSOs do. But then you can look at ancillary companies. So if you're looking for potentially exposure, it could be in packaging or in hydroponic equipment. You know, everyone knows Merida is a big investor in Grow Generation, which has been very successful in new markets because as growers expand, they need more soil, nutrients, equipment, lights, build out, hardware. And so there's ways to play the ancillary. You can play the packaging through Kush. Every time, you know, a new packaging client has to package X amount, all of that cannabis that gets sold needs to be lab tested, packaged, weighed, all that stuff. So we love the validation technologies. We love lab testing, all that stuff. I don't think it's easy to find those companies necessarily, but I think that's where I would look. If I was an individual investor, I would look at the arms merchant, not the necessarily combatants nowadays, because then that way you're exposed to the entire Illinois market, every operator, if you can find those right companies.
Right. John, what do you think about that?
Well, I think maybe I'd make the similar point, but just on a national basis and put the US in the context of what's happening in the rest of the world. You know, we've been talking a lot about the fits and starts of the emergence of the global cannabis economy. And I think particularly given what we've been seeing in the EU over the past month or so, you know, this idea that they're even talking now about regulating CBD like a narcotic, trying to put it under Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, means that I think there's going to be a tightening of the emergence of some of these initially hot-seeming international markets. So if you're an investor who hasn't waded into cannabis yet and had been kind of eagerly anticipating a global explosion in demand, I think the reality is, at least for the next 24 months, all of the action is going to be in the US. All of the meaningful action is going to be in the US. And if we're talking about markets like Illinois, Michigan, New York, New Jersey, Florida, Arizona, all either kind of poised to make the transition this fall or likely to do it in the next 24 months. Just the addition of, you know, 40 to 60 million new Americans gaining access to legal cannabis over and on top of all of the growth that's going to be happening in the markets that are already legal but still in their early stages of growth means that the upside, not just in cannabis retail sales, but in the picks and shovels, the operations or the supplies that will keep this industry operational are going to be phenomenal and on a scale that you're not going to find anywhere else in the world. So while Canada might have had a head start in going rec legal first, there are more Americans that have access to legal, recreational, or adult use cannabis than Canadians total. So, as we think about the emergence of the global cannabis economy, even without federal legalization, we think that the US, particularly given what's happened in the EU over the past month, the US is going to play an absolutely leading role in wealth creation from cannabis over the next 24 months. And so there's, particularly with the MSOs who have the ability to scale into new markets quickly, I think those companies are likely going to see very strong returns over the next couple of years.
It's true. I mean, every time someone flips a switch, there's a new legal market. And I think, John, the point about when you look at the legal markets that haven't flipped yet, there's going to be a point in the next maybe year, hopefully sooner, where all of these articles about this rampant growth in a state becomes kind of like out of, it's not even notable anymore from a, like when I read articles, I mean, look, we consume every article that's written, but you read about the growth of Illinois and it's kind of like, okay, what's next? Because we get it. I mean, we've seen it, we predicted it. And so Michigan's next, and then they're going to talk about New York month by month sales and New Jersey. And it's, at some point we move on from the Diane Fossey gorillas in the mist observation of, oh, the animal of growth becomes more like we expect it. And look, it's growing 30% month over month, but right now you still have this, like, it's an animal that needs to be observed from afar. Get these articles, not from MJ Biz or some of the industry rags, right? But when you get like outside, when it's the Wall Street Journal, they'll talk about like, oh, look at the sales of Illinois, as if it's some kind of unexpected phenomenon. But this is just that transition. That's why it's so important to understand the illicit market to legal transition, because that growth is just grabbing something that's already existing, which is why states who are reticent to move to at least a medical legalization, they can't answer the question. You ask a regulator, what about what's already happening right here, right now? People are consuming cannabis in your state, right? And so I think that when you look at these articles, sorry, John.
No, I was just going to say, they're already consuming it, and at astonishing numbers at that. So.
Right. The growth in Illinois is not shocking, given that there's $4 to $7 billion of it consumed every year anyway. So growing from 200 million to 250 to 300 to 350 to 400, sure, it's worth noting. But like these, 8 exclamation point articles, look at the growth. I mean, you can make a lot more money by predicting the growth and investing for that growth than kind of catching up and being surprised by it. And I think that's why a lot of people in the cannabis space are starting to do really well, because they understood that, pretty quickly. And like I said before, Boris Jordan, chairman of Curaleaf, Eric Mouth, the chairman of Jushi, quoted the same thing, right? He said that he's seeing a lot of transition because of COVID into the legal market. People are talking about this subject because it is the fundamentally easiest thing to understand. It's just common sense. It's like the drug war. One of the arguments for getting rid of the drug war in the 80s was you can't stop consumption. Like shooting planes down over Colombia doesn't stop people from wanting to do cocaine or something, right? It just changes the dynamic of how you regulate it or how you go after it. In this case, the consumption's there, and as legal markets open up, the consumption is flowing in at rates that I'm actually not surprised by a 30% month-over-month gain. It's worth noting, it's great, but I don't think it's remarkable given how much pent-up demand there is just based on what we're seeing in the illicit market.
So maybe just 2 quick thoughts on that. One, clearly, and this is not a political statement, but clearly if the goal of prohibition was to end the demand for cannabis, we failed at that. Depending on, we're actually working through a revision of our total demand estimates for the country. But if you're talking about a $75 billion market at a minimum, one, the legal market has barely scratched the tip of the iceberg. I think we're very early stages into this. And two, the making it illegal clearly did very little to dissuade people from consuming it. And then two, if a key point of legalization is to eliminate the kind of income being earned by malactors, by the gangs, the cartels from this industry, then there's strong incentive for lawmakers and regulators to incentivize consumers to make that transition, not only for public health, but for public safety as well. And so from the industry, I mean, it's much, much cheaper to pull a consumer who already knows cannabis from the unregulated market to the legal one than to create a new consumer. We hear a lot of people talking about big cannabis trying to make everyone a cannabis consumer. It doesn't make sense to do that because the cost of creating a new consumer is dramatically higher than taking a consumer who is participating in an illicit market that who knows what the revenue being generated for that industry is being put toward, and transitioning it into a market which the government can have full authority and oversight over. And clearly governments have done a fairly effective job of regulating the markets where it's legal. So, you know, despite the talk of these 30 to 40% month-over-month growth numbers, which are impressive, we've still barely scratched the tip of this iceberg. And I think, you know, as we get closer to adding that additional 50 to 100 million new Americans, giving them legal access and giving them 2 to 3 years of ability to grow into the legal market, then we'll really start to see what scale of opportunities available in this space. And to investors who might be sitting on the sidelines, that's not the time you're going to want to be entering this market, because by that point, the opportunity to capture what we think are, you know, a once in a generation opportunity for wealth creation, I think will have closed.
It's true.
Yeah. Well, you guys, I could sit here and talk to you all day, but we are almost out of time. Any parting words for our guests before we say goodbye?
I mean, look, it's a pleasure to always have a deep dive on this stuff. This is a subject that we've done so much research on, the consumer. You know, I've enjoyed doing the work with John and having this back and forth for nearly 5 or 6 months. And I do think, like John said, I think it's really important for people to understand that even though stocks, some MSOs have already gone up, the reality is there is a switch that gets flipped each time a state goes. And I think that as you get higher equity prices, maybe there's more M&A, but we're really still kind of early. Florida's not adult use, and look at their medical sales. Pennsylvania, you look at huge markets, but actually where they're going to be, if I gave you a time machine and you went forward 4 years, the numbers today would look paltry. And that I'm willing to bet all the money in my bank account on. There's no chance that 4 years from now, the numbers of cannabis consumption in the legal market aren't dwarfing where we are today. And people look at the growth and they go, oh, now's not the right time. It's growing 30% month over month. I've already missed 5 months of that. We are at the very tip of the iceberg, like John said. I mean, it is early days, because a lot of people don't want to be in a medical registry. We see that behavior all the time. Adult use is what really flips the switch on the massive consumer waterfall. And so when you look at markets like Pennsylvania, Florida, Missouri has 45,000 registered patients before the first product's even available. Oklahoma is a 2 million person state that does bigger sales than, you know, they're doing bigger sales than some people do in adult use. They're almost the size of Colorado, for God's sakes. I mean, you talk about, so it's there. Now it's a matter of if you're an investor, do not be dissuaded by the fact that things, look, be cost conscious, be smart, do your due diligence, do your work. But more importantly, really don't think that you've missed a train. I mean, we're still pretty early in the gross sales. Now you want to pick a company that's going to be able to capture that sales. That's the hard part, right? Predicting that. But it's not hard to predict what the addressable market's going to be 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 4 years from now. It's going to be bigger. That, you have my guarantee on that one. A lot bigger.
I think the only thing I would also add to that is don't underestimate how quickly public attitudes toward all of this.
Great point. Amazing.
You know, we've just seen that Gallup put out a poll saying that 70% of Americans now view smoking cannabis as morally acceptable, which is just an astonishing number. I lived in Virginia for nearly 30 years, and it was one of the most kind of punitive states in prohibition enforcement. They just signed a law decriminalizing cannabis. Up to an ounce, you get nothing more than $25 fine and no criminal record. I would never, even 3 years ago, have thought that a shift like that was going to be happening in a state that has been so historically conservative in its views toward cannabis. And then third, the declaration of cannabis as being an essential service. Despite what might have happened on the regulatory side, the number of consumers who saw that, who were living in unregulated states and watching people in legal markets not only have now legal access to cannabis, but having cannabis be the one industry that's allowed to operate with the police department and the fire department. I would not underestimate the level of envy that has created, and like, why is that not happening here? And so
Great
one
point.
unintended consequence of this COVID season, I think it's going to dramatically accelerate the push for legalization for people who are saying, you know, this is madness. We are locking up our boys and girls. We're locking up minority men in particular. While next door, cannabis is not only the one industry that is declared essential, but seems to be experiencing explosive growth during one of the worst recessionary contractions of our lifetimes. That disconnect between state policies, people watching what's happening next door in the states next door, not in their town, I think is going to be one of the major catalysts for a much more active debate around not just state level legalization, but national legalization in the years to come.
That's an incredible point. I mean, I'll finish by just saying these unique intangibles that we see in cannabis that drive things faster is why you want to have a million of these conversations, because it's true. People look at other states and they say, well, that's essential and I can't even go to Whole Foods. You know, when people look at that disconnect, they realize that there's such a disconnect between the illegality in certain states and the consumer industry in other states. And that, like John said, that's really driving some of the political pressure that's driving, you know, in a state like Virginia, where it went from 0 to 60 really quick. Great point.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap it here. Thank you guys so much for being here today. This is awesome. And thank you to our listeners for joining us at CannaWeek. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. And you can find these news stories and more on New Frontier Data's Cannabis Insights Daily. I'm your host, Heather Wickline, and I will see you next time.